Imagine this. It is the 29th of May, 1453, just before dawn. The air above the Bosphorus is thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood. Somewhere outside the ancient walls of Constantinople, a young soldier named Mehmed, 21 years old, barely older than a boy, stands in silence. He is looking at a city that no army has conquered in 1,000 years. Around him, 80,000 men, cannons, the largest military machine the medieval world had ever seen. And yet, in this moment, he is not issuing orders. He is not making speeches. He is simply standing, watching the dark outline of minarets and domes against a sky that is just beginning to turn gray. In a few hours, everything that was will no longer be, and the world, the entire Islamic world, will never be the same again. Let us travel forward, not by centuries, but by decades, to a city that Mehmed's descendants built into one of the most magnificent places on earth. It is the late 19th century, Istanbul. A young man named Tarek wakes before sunrise in a small apartment near the bazaar. He is a student, a minor civil servant's son. He studies theology, yes, but he also studies French. He reads newspapers. He argues about philosophy in coffee houses until midnight. His world is enormous. In a single afternoon, he can walk from a neighborhood where Greek Orthodox priests pass in dark robes to a street where Jewish merchants argue in Ladino, to a mosque where the call to prayer rises above everything else in the city. This is not chaos. This is order, Ottoman order, 600 years in the making. But something is wrong. Everyone can feel it. The empire is shrinking. Province by province, border by border, it is losing ground. The newspapers that Tarek reads are full of words like reform, constitution, modernization, and underneath all of it, a quieter, more frightening question that no one says out loud. What happens to us, to our faith, to our identity, if this empire falls? Tarek does not know yet that he is living in the final chapter. None of them do. To understand why the Ottoman Empire mattered, not just politically, but spiritually, you have to understand what it was holding together. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from the steppes of Ukraine to the deserts of Yemen. It governed an estimated 1/3 of the world's Muslim population. It controlled Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem simultaneously. No single political entity in the history of Islam had ever done that. And here is a number that should stop you cold. At its height, the empire administered over 70 distinct ethnic and religious communities, simultaneously under a single legal framework. 70. There were more active religious courts in Ottoman Cairo in the 16th century than there were in all of Western Europe combined. The sultans called themselves Khalifa, the symbolic successor to the prophet's authority on earth. This was not just a title, it was a gravitational center for the entire Islamic world, a source of legitimacy, of belonging, of something that scholars who write about Islamic history rarely name directly: spiritual security. When you knew that one of the holiest cities on earth was protected by a Muslim ruler, that the pilgrimage routes to Mecca were guarded and maintained, there was a kind of peace in that, a kind of rootedness. It would not last. Here is what most people get wrong about the Ottomans. They get remembered as conquerors, warriors, men with cannons and cavalry, and yes, that is part of the story, but it is not the deepest part. The Ottomans were first and foremost builders of institutions. The thing that made them extraordinary in the history of Islam was not how they won wars, it was what they built after the wars ended. Consider this: when Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, his first act was not to tear down the churches, it was to issue a decree protecting the Christian and Jewish communities of the city. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch within weeks of the conquest. He invited Jewish communities expelled from Spain 40 years later to settle inside Ottoman borders. In a century when Europe was burning people for heresy, the Ottoman system, The millet system was allowing different communities to govern themselves according to their own religious laws. This is the untold story. This is the part of Ottoman history that the mainstream narrative buries beneath centuries of silence about sieges and sultans. The Ottomans created something the world had never seen, a multi-confessional Islamic empire that was also one of the most religiously diverse civilizations on earth, not in spite of Islam, because of it, because of a specific, sophisticated interpretation of Islamic governance that took the Quranic concept of protecting Ahl al-Dhimma, protected communities, and turned it into a working legal framework for millions of people across 3 continents. But here is the question that every student of Islamic documentary history must eventually ask: if the system worked so well, why did it fall? And the answer is one of the most heartbreaking stories in the entire history of Islam. Before I get to that, to the part that most historians never talk about, the part that will completely reframe everything you just heard, I want you to understand why this story survived at all, why a civilization that fell over 100 years ago still shapes the dreams and anxieties of over 1 billion people today. Hold that question. We're almost there. The 19th century broke the Ottoman Empire, not in one moment, but slowly, the way great things usually break, through accumulation, through pressure from outside and fracture from within. European powers chipped away at Ottoman territory for decades. The Industrial Revolution had shifted the balance of military power in ways the empire could not absorb fast enough. Nationalist movements, inspired, ironically, by the very ideas of liberty and self-determination that the Enlightenment had produced in Europe, began pulling the empire apart from the inside. Reform after reform was attempted. Some were brilliant, many were too late. And then came the First World War, and then came 1922, and then came the man who would complete what the wars had started. Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk, abolished the Sultanate, then the Caliphate, then the religious courts. He Latinized the alphabet, he banned the fez, he moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. In the span of a few years, he dismantled not just a government, but a symbolic architecture that had held the Islamic world together for 6 centuries. The Caliphate, that gravitational center, was gone overnight. And here is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Because the Ottoman legacy did not die, it went underground, it transformed. Walk through Cairo today, and you will find Ottoman architecture in the oldest mosques of the city. Walk through Sarajevo, and you will find Ottoman law embedded in the rhythms of daily life. Walk through Jerusalem, the old city, the covered markets, the hierarchies of religious authority, and you are walking through an Ottoman spatial design that is over 400 years old. The Islamic documentary tradition that Fact Seeker is built on, the tradition of finding Muslim communities in the corners of the world and telling their stories, is itself, in a profound way, an Ottoman inheritance. Because the Ottomans were the first political entity in history to codify the idea that Muslim communities anywhere in the world deserved protection and recognition. That Islam was not just a faith for the Arab heartland, it was a civilizational project, a global one. Today, more than 1.5 billion Muslims live across every continent on earth. They practice in dozens of languages, they inhabit dozens of legal and political systems, and many of them carry in the very structure of their religious imagination a quiet longing for exactly what the Ottoman world once represented. The idea that this community, this ummah, is one thing, whole, held together. That longing is not nostalgia, it is something deeper. It is the memory of a world that once made it real. And it survives, not in empires, not in governments, but in the way a grandmother in Bosnia folds her prayer rug, in the way a scholar in Malaysia traces his intellectual lineage back through Istanbul, in the untold stories, the hidden ones, the ones buried in the ordinary lives of ordinary people that are still, quietly, carrying the weight of 600 years. Empires, it turns out, do not die cleanly. They leave behind something that cannot be mapped or measured, a way of seeing, a set of assumptions about what is possible, a vision of the world that outlasts every treaty and every tombstone. The Ottoman Empire built one of the most ambitious projects in Islamic history, the attempt to hold together the diversity of a global faith under a single canopy of justice and law. It failed in the end, as all empires fail, slowly, then all at once. But the question it tried to answer, how do we live together across difference and still remain one, is not a dead question. It is the question of our time. And somewhere tonight, in a city you have probably never heard of, a young man or woman is asking it again, in their own language, in their own prayers, in their own small, irreplaceable act of faith. That is the Ottoman legacy. Not the walls, not the cannons, not the palace on the hill. That question, still unanswered, still alive. Now, before you leave, I want to ask you something. If what you just watched moved you, if you found yourself thinking, I had no idea this was so deep, so human, so connected to right now, then there is something you should know. Right now, there are hundreds of communities just like the ones we traced through this story. Muslim communities living extraordinary, invisible lives in the corners of the world that history books forgot. Communities in the frozen tundras of Siberia, in the heart of the Amazon, in communist states where faith survived without a single public institution to protect it. In the streets of cities you walk through every day, each one carrying a story this powerful, this untold, this human. That is exactly what Fact Seeker exists to do. Every single video on this channel is a door into a world you were never shown. If you want to keep opening those doors, if you want to be the person who actually knows these stories, subscribe to Fact Seeker right now. Not because we're asking you to, but because you have already proven in the last 10 minutes that you are exactly the kind of person who needs to know these things. The next door opens very soon. We'll see you there.